So who all remembers the Brooklyn Nets back a few years ago when they made that trade for Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett, Jason Terry, and they brought in Joe Johnson as well. They had this thought that maybe they could form this big three, or not big three, big five with Lopez and Darren Williams to beat Miami, and that plan wasn't necessarily a bad idea. It was just a few, I'd say a year or two at the least early. And especially they brought in a rookie head coach, which Jason Kidd is not a bad coach per se, but it's just you had Darren Williams, who at the time was one of the best point guards in the league, but it was pretty much from that year on is when he began his decline from being one of the best point guards in the NBA to what he is now as kind of just an average washed-up veteran player. Joe Johnson was still giving you 18 to 20 a game, but he wasn't the player that he was in Atlanta. Paul Pierce was still good, old, but he was still good. I mean, even I'd say up until last year, he was effective, not as much as in 2008 and in his prime. Same thing along with Kevin Garnett. But both those guys really stepped up. But the big thing was Brook Lopez got hurt, and that was a big deal. And that's kind of my problem with Brook Lopez is he kind of gets hurt, but I'll get into that later. But following that trade, they traded away 3 first-round picks to get these guys, which ultimately just didn't pan out, and then they pretty much all left the year after that, leaving Brooklyn with pretty much nothing. They lost Darren Williams, they traded away Joe Johnson, or he left in free agency, I don't know, but it doesn't matter. He left, and they kind of got left in this team of nothingness, where there was no future, no first-round picks. They did make some moves. They brought in Thad Young. But at the end of the day, like, this team was just going nowhere. Even the owner sold his stock in the team. The GM was terrible. They fired him. But this new GM that they brought has been making some quality moves. One of them was trading away Thad Young for what would have been a first-round pick, which is now Karis LeVert, who is going to be a decent young player. He's a nice 3-and-D player. Along with signing some younger players, which I'm going to get into. So for this next season, the Brooklyn Nets quietly just had one of the best off seasons in the league. Just at this, like, they had one of the best off seasons when you rank all the teams. They went from a team with absolutely no future, no potential, just a straight dumpster fire, to some kind of image, some kind of backbone. I wouldn't say that they're going to be contenders or that they have a chance to maybe down the road win a future. I think there's still a lot more moves to make, but there at least is some hope that the front office knows what they're doing. So I'm going to start off with probably just like their starting 5 and some few people off the bench. Bringing in Jeremy Lin was an awesome move. You get a guy who, honestly, it isn't fair, the expectations this guy has on his shoulders. I mean, you had Linsanity in New York, which, you know, nothing, no discredit to him or anything. He played out of his mind, and I think he's capable of playing to a fraction of that. I don't think he'll be putting up like 25 a game, but I still think that he can definitely be a very valuable starting point guard. And some people don't believe it, you know, looking at Houston and part of LA, but when you're looking at those two teams, he was playing on a team with ball dominant players like James Harden and Kobe Bryant, where Jeremy Lin is more effective when he's on the ball. He can play very well off the ball, but on the ball is when he's better operating the pick and roll. He's a poor man Steve Nash. He's not Steve Nash by any means, but you get what I mean. He's a poor man Steve Nash. He's definitely capable of being a starting point guard, as you saw in Charlotte. Charlotte last year was low-key one of the best teams in the East, which even in the NBA as well. But Jeremy Lin proved that he can still play in this league. He's still relatively young. He's probably exiting his prime within these past 2 years, but bringing him into Brooklyn is definitely the right move. Tyler Johnson would have been huge to bring him in. He was a 4-year player in college, played very well in Miami. He would have been huge along with Alan Crabb, but unfortunately those two were restricted free agents. If they got those two players, it just would have been done deal. Just this team is on the rise. But you have Bojan Bogdanovic, who's a decent three-point shooter, not much of a defender. He's a decent player to have on your roster, but in terms of him starting, that's not going to be cutting it. Their rookie last year, Rondé Hollis Jefferson, which I actually don't have him in the gameplay, but he's there. There's no two-way Rondé Hollis Jefferson, so that's why he's not there. But Rondé Hollis Jefferson is an athletic defender, not much of a shooter, but that can be fixed. His mechanics aren't too out of whack, and hopefully he can just keep building on that. He had a decent rookie year. The only problem that I see with him is I'm not sure about his ceiling. I watched a little bit of him in the Summer League. I didn't watch too much from him last year, but his ceiling to me doesn't seem that high. Not like he's going to be a franchise player, and that's kind of my problem with the Brooklyn Nets right now is they don't really have that game-changing player that like they can be that you could just build off of. I mean, I guess maybe Jeremy Lin could, but there really isn't anyone. Like when you look at the Sixers, they drafted Ben Simmons, or if you look at, I don't know, Minnesota, they got a Karl Anthony Towns. There's just no transcendent player that will take them to the next level. But Rondé Hollis Jefferson, no discrediting him. He is a solid NBA player, and I think he was definitely the right move to make with the pick that they had last year, or whenever they drafted him. Sean Kilpatrick, they signed this offseason. Great experienced player, 4-year college player, very good in college, and he's been slowly trying to find his role on an NBA team, and I think he found it in Brooklyn as being a guy who can just score the ball, make the right play. Definitely someone you want to have. I'd like to see him start, but they will probably start Randy Foye, who is a solid pickup this offseason. Decent shooter, veteran player, will help with their core of young players. They signed Luis Scola, not the player he was 5 years ago, but he's definitely can still contribute as he did in Toronto as someone off the bench. I'd like to see possibly Chris McCullough be starting, but they might start Scola. Well, they signed Trevor Booker, nice muscle player, rebounds, defends, decent mid-range. So then they have Brook Lopez, who is 28 years old, who's going to be exiting his prime pretty soon. And he's honestly been injured for most of it, which kind of bothers me. He's a decent offensive player, not the greatest rebounder, not the greatest defender. And I mean, if he can stay healthy, that's great. I think him and Jeremy Lin could be a great pick and roll duo. But honestly, I would try and trade him. I like the idea of Nerlens Noel or a Taj Gibson coming to Brooklyn, but I think that's going to be difficult to pry any one of those players loose, especially in Philly with the logjam of big men. And I don't know if Chicago would take on Brook Lopez and maybe to bring together him and his brother. But the idea is Greg Monroe coming. He's essentially the same player as Brook Lopez. I don't know. Maybe just going younger and he'd have an opportunity because Milwaukee definitely doesn't want Greg Monroe. But I don't really know with Brook Lopez. I would try and move him. I don't know what you can get for him with his injury history, but he's a solid player in his own right. Definitely a great low post scorer. And he's been there. He's been on the franchise for a while. All in all, this team definitely got some youth injected into them, which is good. They're starting to build a young core, and I'd like to see them build off of that, but they still have more moves to make because their ceiling right now, I think best case scenario, not this year, but possibly next year. At the earliest, they could be competing for an 8th to 6th seed. 5th seed might be overdoing it, but besides that, like that's just where they're destined to be with this roster. There's just not enough talent to get them over the hump to be a contender in the East, especially just with LeBron James and the development of the Raptors and the Celtics. I just don't think that they have enough talent to do that. So possibly just trying to assemble more draft picks, maybe move Brook Lopez and just maybe tank this year. Not tank, but just trade him for some draft picks and try and develop your young players. I think that's the move that they're going to have to make. Though they won't be the worst team in the division this year. That will probably be the Sixers, but they won't be better than Boston, Toronto, or New York. But this is definitely an improvement over last year. All's looking good in Brooklyn. I'd like to see a few more moves be made, but all in all, I think this team could definitely be this year a definitely high 20s, but in between kind of 32 and 35 wins. I'd like to see them pull that off. So yeah, next video I'm going to be doing the Phoenix Suns. So let's get this video to 5 likes, and I'll give my opinion on the Phoenix Suns. All right, have a good day, guys.